Horror media has always towed a thin line between confronting the viewer with uncomfortable truths and just plain shock value. Horror media, in my opinion, is at its best when it's pulling back the curtain on some of the less favorable parts of society that we like to pretend don't exist. It should guide us to see the uncomfortable bits and challenge us to grow. There are 3 games recently that Steam and itch.io deemed as too much in their depictions of horror, and specifically sexual violence. The first one is Vile Exhumed, a horror game depicting a parasocial relationship between a viewer and former adult content creator. The second one is Mouthwashing, a pixelated horror game about a ship crash and the devolving relationships of the cast. And lastly, Fear and Hunger, another pixelated indie horror game known for its brutal mechanics and Lovecraftian-type lore. I've played Mouthwashing and Fear and Hunger and was looking forward to playing Vile Exhumed, and with the 3 being either banned or shadow banned or just completely removed from the stores, I wanted to talk about it a little further, what it might mean for the industry, and why these games were removed. Before we start, my name is KX Cobraful. You can call me Cobbs. I like to play horror as well as some other games, but my favorite thing to do is to come over to YouTube and yap about these horror games. And as Fear and Hunger and Mouthwashing are 2 of my favorite, when I saw the news about them being delisted and shadow banned, I kind of wanted to come on here and talk a little bit more about why I thought this happened. I just want to say up front, I don't think any of these games should have been removed. Maybe Mouthwashing, but I'll get to that when we get to the Mouthwashing bit. But in this video, I want to take a good look at why they might have been targeted in this campaign against sexually violent content and NSFW content as a whole. But before we get any further into it, I'm just saying I am on these developer sides. None of these games should have been removed, but I will let the rest of the video play. Before we get into each individual game and why I believe they were removed, we should start at the beginning with a game called No Mercy and an organization called Collective Shout. For those of you who don't know, Collective Shout is an Australian group that speaks out against the objectification of women and sexualizing of girls, which on its own is an admirable goal. I'll leave it up to you guys to figure out whether they have gone too far. No Mercy was a visual erotic novel that released earlier this year that found its way into Collective Shout's crossfire. I can't speak on whether this game deserved to be taken down, as I have not played it, nor have I seen any footage of it. What I have seen online, though, is that it contained an array of fun time activity content, some of which pushed the boundaries of Steam's guidelines. This was the primary bit that I believe caught Collective Shout's attention. If what I have read online is true, then the content in No Mercy probably warranted its removal, but in full transparency, I have not played the game nor seen it. If what I've read about the game is true, though, then I really don't have a desire to play or see it or do any further research on it. Collective Shout used the inflammatory content in No Mercy to put additional pressure on Steam, itch.io, and their payment process to take a stricter stance on NSFW games on their respective platforms. Like I said before, Vile Exhumed, Mouthwashing, and Fear and Hunger were 3 of these games that were recently delisted or shadow banned due to the additional pressure. So, let's move on and talk more about why they were banned. Vile Exhumed is our first victim of the campaign and seems to be the most notable and primary of the 3. It is an indie horror text-based game where you search through a computer and along the way discover a toxic parasocial relationship between an obsessed man and an adult horror film actress. I've not played this one yet, but it's been at the forefront of headlines when people are talking about what Steam and itch.io are doing, and a lot of people view the delisting of this game as extremely unfair. I'll be talking about this one a little more later because I have opinions, but all you need to know is that it was delisted off of Steam this week. Mouthwashing, spoilers ahead, is a game that is heavily dependent on the character interactions and the narrative. Whereas Fear and Hunger and Vile Exhumed have gameplay mechanics that can be enjoyed outside of the existing narrative, Mouthwashing is a story game first and foremost. Where many people believe it fell victim to Collective Shout's campaign is the sexual violence that is implied from Jimmy towards Anya. Nothing is ever depicted visually, which is important to note, but it is directly implied that Jimmy was sexually assaulting Anya, and that Captain Curly knew of it but chose to ignore what was happening as it would put him in a difficult position with his friend. I've been wanting to talk about how Captain Curly is just as responsible for the events in Mouthwashing as Jimmy is, but that is a ramble for another video. The point is, there is sexual violence directly implied to the player, but it is not shown on screen. This is what many people are grabbing the pitchforks for, and understandably so. Stories like Mouthwashing are so important because it can be all too easy for people to ignore the actions of someone like Jimmy due to their pre-existing friendships with him. That being said, I do not believe this is the reason Mouthwashing was delisted from itch.io. It looks like, according to an admin from the website, the developers for Mouthwashing are using the itch.io download button as a link to Steam, and that the developer actually took down any playable files from the store page back in 2024. I can't get into the semantics on how this even happened to begin with because I'm just not knowledgeable about how itch.io's website works, but Mouthwashing is still up on Steam's page, so we can probably assume that this was the case and that it was not a case of policing the implied sexually violent content. I did want to include Mouthwashing, though, in this video, as the big thing that was going around Twitter at the time of writing the script was that Fear and Hunger, Vile Exhumed, and Mouthwashing had all become victims of Collective Shout's campaign, which maybe in a way they all have, but Mouthwashing, it looks like, was removed for an entirely different reason. So I did want to clarify that. Lastly, one of my favorite games was shadow banned from itch.io. If you're like me and don't really know what that means, I looked it up. Don't worry. It essentially means that if you have the direct link to the store page for Fear and Hunger on itch.io saved somewhere, you can still use that in your search bar and go to the store page. That being said, when you search up Fear and Hunger on itch.io, it will not come up. Anyways, Fear and Hunger is a pretty simple game. Go into dungeon, accomplish the task you set out to do based on the playable character you chose, then ideally leave dungeon. Once you get in there though, things get a bit more complicated. Fear and Hunger wants you to feel weak and helpless and accomplishes this in numerous creative ways. You cannot level your character, and the enemies are overwhelmingly tough with the ability to remove your limbs during combat. And God forbid you lose all 4 limbs and somehow survive combat, your playable character will just sit stationary until you realize the game is forcing you to admit defeat and restart from an earlier save. Unfortunately, I can see why Fear and Hunger might have found itself on Collective Shout's radar. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying I could see how it found its way on there. There are several game over scenes that are extraordinarily sexually violent in their fullest extent. Not that I make a lot of money off of these videos to begin with, but to avoid demonetization, I'm going to kind of avoid being any more specific. That being said, itch.io released a statement recently saying that they are conducting a comprehensive audit of content to ensure that they can meet the requirements of their payment processors. They also noted their response was different from Steam's due to the difference in platform. Steam is a closed platform where every product page is approved before it appears in the store, whereas itch.io is an open user-generated content platform. Anyone can publish content at any time with minimal barriers, thus a broader review is necessary. They also noted here that if they lose the ability to accept payments from a partner like PayPal or Stripe, then it impacts all creators' ability to do business, so they are doing what they can to protect their payment processing abilities. This is what's hard about a smaller platform like itch.io. They really don't have the resources or the bandwidth to stick up to the payment processor's requests the way that Steam or Valve might, so they're honestly kind of getting bullied here, which doesn't make it okay or fair to the horror creators that are now having their stuff taken down and losing that income. But it's very much a situation where payment processors are absolutely limiting what the consumer can buy, and a platform like itch.io that again doesn't have that resources or bandwidth available that Steam might is doing what they can to protect the creators that are existing on the platform and their ability to make money. It's very slimy. And if you feel like MasterCard or Visa are trying to police the content you have access to, you're right, they absolutely are. Anyways, I believe Fear and Hunger and Vile Exhumed both represent the crux of the issue here. Violence has been a primary staple of most types of media for years now, but gaming is one of the only types of media that gives the player the autonomy to participate, allowing them to choose to do horrendous things. Actions committed in-game, though, do not reflect outward morality, just as violent or sexually violent themes in games do not reflect the developer's morality or approval of those themes. The inclusion of these topics does not indicate their outright approval. If we are not able to explore these themes that are present in our daily lives in a safer and more digestible context, how will we ever get to a full understanding of them as well as ourselves as people? I can't speak on Vile Exhumed as I've not seen the images or graphics that reportedly got the game removed. But from what I've read from the developer, they were all pictures of the developer herself, as she wanted to create a piece of art that shined a light on a particularly cruel part of a taboo industry where women are often exploited. If the goal of Collective Shout is to protect women, shouldn't a piece of art exposing how they are often exploited be something we support? And like I said, I haven't seen these photos, but from what I've seen online, they are not sexually suggestive. They just look like someone who is tied up. It reminds me of This Is the Game, which is a game that Markiplier played a while ago about a girl who had been kidnapped into a red room. And The goal of This Is the Game is to essentially dive into the deep dark web and find where the red room is so that you can save the girl. There's several really disturbing images in that game, but at the time it was okay. But apparently now a much smaller indie horror creator isn't allowed to publish her particular piece of art because of the timing of it. Like, do you see what I mean? There's just a lot of double standards here. If the goal of Collective Shout is to protect women, shouldn't a piece of art exposing how they are often exploited be something we support? Especially when it comes from a woman who has stated outright that this piece of media is part of her story. How are we silencing women in the pursuit of protecting them? Make that make sense. I went digging for the tweets where the developer said this. I could not find them, so I'm not entirely sure if she is retelling a story that she is familiar with or that was part of her own life story, but regardless, from what I can tell, it has credibility. As Vile Exhumed is a text-based game, I believe what got it removed, like I said earlier, were the photos of the developer herself depicted as tied up. Since Steam, in theory, cannot confirm that these people are not actually in harmful situations, this is probably what got the game removed. That being said, it kind of feels like Vile Exhumed and Final Girl Games as the developer are these sacrificial lambs to appease Collective Shout's campaign. There are plenty of other games that show women and people in general in compromising positions. Like I referenced earlier with This Is the Game, and Fear and Hunger, for example, as well, literally has scenes where enemies are taking advantage of other characters against their will. Granted, it's pixelated, but, the violence is still there. Final Girl Games, the developer of Vile Exhumed, is listed under the publisher Dread XP, which has also published many other titles, one of which being The Mortuary Assistant. The Mortuary Assistant took the internet by storm back in 2022, has a well thought out story, and plenty of graphic and uncomfortable scenes. After its success, it was picked up by Shudder, a horror-focused TV network, to produce a movie based around the events in the game. So, clearly very popular. Brian Clark, the developer of The Mortuary Assistant, had this to say about Vile Exhumed being removed from Steam. Horror often deals with themes we find unsettling. I personally subscribe to everything is on the table when it comes to horror if it serves the story and message. Back in 2018, in my first entry into indie, I created all the dark web pages for a game by another developer. I spent months writing some of the darkest shit I've dreamed up. I photoshopped tons of questionable content for all those pages with many suggestive themes. That game is still available on Steam to this day, as it should be, with far, far worse themes and suggestive content than Vile. I don't usually dip into that well for my own games, but that's only because my games so far have simply been different ideas that don't call for it. I'm not above the mud if it punctuates my message in a game. Yes, some games lean on the shocking nature of something vulgar to stand out without substance, and that doesn't interest me personally. Vile is not that, which is why I'm writing this. This is a failure on Steam's part to review content properly. Horror needs a place where the freaks are welcome. I have faith that Dread XP will help take a bit of a stand here. I don't want the billionth mascot horror. I want Vile and those like Final Girl Gaming who are unafraid to explore story, concepts, and mechanics that expand our space and challenge it. Let's grow indie horror instead of funneling it into the most consumer-friendly version of itself. If you want to support Vile, keep an eye on Final Girl Gaming and Dread XP games. At the end of the day, horror is not for everyone, and there are certain topics and subjects that may not be suitable for everyone, thus the inclusion of trigger and content warnings. My point is not that everyone should play horror or that every piece of horror media is okay. That being said, when horror media, and games specifically, are made to tell a difficult-to-hear story, it does not feel right that we should silence that. As Brian Clark said, some games lean on the shocking nature of something vulgar to stand out without substance, and that can be overdone and tiring. But a game that is telling a hard-to-hear story, that is not something that should be silenced. I'm hoping that this is not the start of a trend. We started a few years ago when lobbyists put pressure on payment processors to stop their dealings with OnlyFans, that did not work out the way that the payment processors hoped. I don't know if anyone remembers OnlyFans saying that we're no longer going to have sexual content on here, but it clearly did not last very long. My hope is that this entire situation goes in a similar direction, that the public backlash is enough for the payment processors to ease the pressure being put on Steam and itch.io. That being said, I am worried that this is a part of an overarching censorship trend. We just saw YouTube announced that they'll require IDs for US users that are AI identified as being under 18. I'm not as well versed, but from what I understand, the UK has also done something similar recently. I don't want to feed into conspiracy theories or anything like that. I like to think I take a pretty rational approach to this kind of things, but all of this happening at once is just a little concerning. At the time of writing the script, Kotaku actually released an article diving into some of the counter campaigns against collective shouts. It seems that most of the work is being done by calling Visa and MasterCard and filing complaints for the pressure that they are putting on Steam and itch.io. From what they've stated, at first it started a bit slow, but it now seems that the supervisors and the call reps are reacting pretty negatively to people calling to complain, putting people on indefinite holds, and even reading from an ending speech type script just to wrap up the calls and get off the phone. It's clear that they're frustrated, and I understand that customer service is not an easy industry to work in, but it seems like the voice of those that are concerned about this kind of censorship is starting to get through to them, which is kind of all we could hope for at this point. While this seems like a silly issue on the surface, it shows a concerning trend of payment processors having control over the products that we as consumers have legal access to. The lack of research into these games before they were shadow banned or outright delisted is actually outrageous and is a pattern that hopefully does not continue. I've done some digging and found various petitions and other resources for speaking out against Collective Shout's campaign, and those will all be listed in the description as well. What do you think though? Did I miss something? Is there another article or post out there with more info? Feel free to let me know in the comments. I know this is a little different from some of the normal content that I do, but I felt it kind of important to talk about as people in this space. If you have a voice, it usually deserves to be heard, and I have a voice, so I wanted to bitch and moan about a bunch of games that I enjoy being delisted for absolutely no fucking reason. Like I said, if you guys have found any other resources out there, please leave them in the comments. Make sure your voice is heard, and I will see you in the next video. Peace!